Chapter 1. The Invitation. The invitations had arrived mysteriously, slipped under doors or left in mailboxes without a trace of the sender. Mark and Lisa, a young couple new to Pine Hollow, found theirs one crisp morning. It was an ornate card, edged with gold leaf, and inscribed with an elegant, flowing script. You are cordially invited to the grand 4th of July celebration at the Fairbanks estate. Join us for an unforgettable night of revelry and wonder. Festivities begin at sunset. The allure of the unknown piqued their curiosity. They had heard rumors about the Fairbanks estate from their neighbors' stories of a grand family that had vanished overnight, leaving behind a house filled with whispers and shadows. The idea of a party in such a place was both thrilling and terrifying. As the sun began its slow descent, casting a blood-red hue across the sky, Mark and Lisa prepared for the evening. Lisa chose a simple yet elegant dress, its dark color matching the growing sense of dread she couldn't quite shake. Mark, in his usual casual attire, tried to reassure her, masking his own apprehension with forced enthusiasm. "It's just an old house," he said, forcing a smile. "What's the worst that could happen?" They drove towards the outskirts of town, where the forest thickened and the road became little more than a narrow, winding path. The deeper they ventured, the more isolated they felt. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional call of a distant owl. Finally, the Fairbanks estate came into view. The mansion stood atop a hill, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. It was a Gothic monstrosity, with tall spires and turrets that seemed to pierce the heavens. The windows were dark, empty sockets staring down with an unsettling vacancy. Weeds and wildflowers choked the once grand gardens, and ivy clung to the stone walls like the grasping hands of the dead. They parked their car near the grand iron gates, which stood open as if welcoming them into the jaws of some great beast. Other cars were already there, their occupants making their way towards the mansion. Strangely, everyone seemed to move in silence, their faces devoid of expression. It was as if they were sleepwalking, drawn by an unseen force. Mark and Lisa hesitated at the gate, exchanging uneasy glances. "Are you sure about this?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "We've come this far," Mark replied, though his own voice was tinged with doubt. "Let's at least see what's inside." As they stepped through the gates, the air grew colder, and a shiver ran down Lisa's spine. The mansion's front doors, massive and intricately carved with scenes of revelry and despair, creaked open on their own as they approached. The sound echoed through the empty halls like a dying groan. Inside, the foyer was vast and shadowed, the flickering light of chandeliers casting eerie patterns on the walls. Cobwebs draped the corners like ghostly curtains, and a thick layer of dust coated the marble floors. The air was stale, carrying the scent of decay and abandonment. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. A man stood in the center of the foyer, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit. His face was pale, almost cadaverous, and his eyes glinted with an unnatural light. "Welcome," he intoned, his voice smooth yet cold. "We are delighted you could join us tonight. The celebration will begin shortly. Please, make yourselves comfortable." There was something unsettling about him, something that made the hairs on the back of Mark's neck stand up. But they had little choice but to follow the throng of guests filtering into the grand ballroom. The room was a relic of opulence, with faded tapestries and tarnished gold accents. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals catching the dim light and scattering it in fractured patterns across the walls. A long table was set against one wall, laden with an array of food and drink. At first glance, it appeared inviting, but upon closer inspection, the offerings seemed oddly artificial. The fruit looked waxy, the meats too perfect, and the wine had a strange, metallic sheen. Yet the other guests approached the table eagerly, filling their plates and glasses without a second thought. Mark and Lisa found a quieter corner of the room, observing the bizarre scene unfolding around them. The guests moved with a mechanical precision, their eyes glazed and unfocused. It was as if they were under a spell, their actions dictated by some unseen puppet master. Lisa shivered, her unease growing. Something's not right here, Mark. These people, they don't seem real. Mark nodded, his eyes scanning the room. I know. It's like we're in a nightmare. The doors to the ballroom suddenly closed with a resounding thud, and the room fell into a hushed silence. The man in the black suit reappeared, standing on a small platform at the far end of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice carrying a chilling authority. The time has come for the festivities to truly begin. As if on cue, the lights dimmed, and the only illumination came from the flickering candles scattered throughout the room. The guests turned to face the man, their expressions blank, their movements synchronized like marionettes on strings. The man raised his hands, and a low, ominous chant began to fill the room. It was a language unknown to Mark and Lisa, its syllables harsh and guttural, reverberating through the very walls of the mansion. The temperature plummeted, and an icy wind seemed to swirl around them, though the windows and doors remained tightly shut. Mark took Lisa's hand, squeezing it tightly. We need to leave, he whispered urgently. Now. But as they turned towards the exit, they found their path blocked by the other guests, who now stood in a tight circle around them. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes empty and cold. It was as if they had become one with the house, extensions of its malevolent will. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest, fear gripping her like a vice. What do we do? She gasped, tears welling in her eyes. Mark looked around desperately, searching for any means of escape. The walls seemed to close in on them, the shadows deepening, taking on sinister shapes. We fight, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We don't let them take us. The man in the black suit began to chant louder, his voice rising to a fever pitch. The air crackled with energy, and the floor beneath them seemed to tremble. Lisa felt a pressure building in her head, a relentless, pounding force that threatened to overwhelm her. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, the chandelier overhead flickered violently, casting a blinding light across the room. For a brief moment, the spell was broken, and the guests faltered, their expressions flickering with confusion. Seizing the opportunity, Mark and Lisa pushed through the crowd, heading for the nearest door. They didn't know where it led, but anything was better than staying in that accursed ballroom. The door gave way under their weight, and they stumbled into a dark, narrow corridor. The sound of the chanting faded behind them, replaced by the oppressive silence of the house. They ran blindly, their footsteps echoing through the halls. The mansion seemed to shift around them, its layout twisting and changing, as if trying to trap them within its malevolent embrace. At last, they found themselves in a small, dusty room. Lisa collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Mark leaned against the door, listening for any signs of pursuit. I think we lost them, he whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. Lisa nodded, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. What is this place, Mark? What have we gotten ourselves into? Mark shook his head, unable to provide an answer. The house seemed alive, its walls pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. They were trapped in a waking nightmare, with no clear way out. As they caught their breath, the distant sound of fireworks echoed through the halls, a stark reminder of the outside world they had left behind. The celebration was just beginning, but for Mark and Lisa, the night was far from over. And somewhere in the darkness, the house watched, waiting patiently for its next move. Chapter 2. The Mansion. The silence that enveloped the narrow corridor was suffocating. Mark and Lisa, their breaths heavy with fear, could feel the weight of the mansion pressing down on them. The walls seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, the very air thick with an oppressive sense of dread. The corridor was dimly lit by flickering sconces, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach out and grasp at the couple as they moved. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, groaning like the bones of a restless giant. Each step they took echoed through the narrow space, amplifying their fear. Mark tried to maintain a facade of calm for Lisa's sake, but his mind raced with terror. Every door they passed was closed, each one an ominous, silent guardian of whatever horrors lay behind it. The walls were adorned with faded portraits, the eyes of long-dead Fairbanks ancestors seeming to follow their every move. Their faces were stern and cold, as if they disapproved of the intruders trespassing in their domain. "Mark," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to find a way out of here." "I know," he replied, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "We'll find a way. We just need to stay calm and keep moving." They reached the end of the corridor, where a large, ornate door loomed before them. Unlike the others, this door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out into the darkness. Mark hesitated, then pushed the door open cautiously. The room beyond was a library, its walls lined with towering shelves filled with dusty tomes and ancient manuscripts. The air in the library was different, stale and musty, with a hint of something rotten. A large, cracked window allowed a weak beam of moonlight to filter in, casting eerie patterns on the floor. In the center of the room was a massive oak desk, cluttered with papers and an old-fashioned oil lamp. The faint glow of the lamp provided the only real light in the room, casting deep shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. Lisa approached one of the shelves, her fingers brushing over the spines of the books. "These are so old," she murmured, pulling out a particularly thick volume. "They look like they haven't been touched in years." Mark joined her, scanning the titles. Many were in languages he couldn't recognize, their covers adorned with strange symbols and intricate designs. He picked up a small, leather-bound book and opened it, only to find its pages blank, as if the words had been sucked into the void. "Let's not linger," he said, placing the book back on the shelf. "This place gives me the creeps." They moved towards the far end of the library, where another door stood partially concealed by a heavy velvet curtain. As they approached, a cold draft seeped through the gap, carrying with it the faint sound of whispering voices. Lisa pulled the curtain aside, revealing a dark, narrow staircase descending into the depths of the mansion. "Do you think this leads to the basement?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "Only one way to find out," Mark replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. "We need to explore every option." They began their descent, the steps groaning under their weight. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispering voices became clearer, though they still couldn't understand the words. It was as if the very walls were alive, murmuring secrets and malevolence. The staircase ended in a large, open space, a basement, but unlike any they had seen before. It was cavernous, with stone walls that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of mold and decay. In the center of the room was a large, circular table, surrounded by high-backed chairs. The table was set with an array of strange, arcane objects, candles, crystals, and what looked like ancient ritualistic tools. A large, intricately carved book lay open at the center, its pages filled with strange symbols and diagrams. Mark and Lisa approached the table cautiously, their eyes drawn to the book. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift on the page, as if alive. Mark reached out to touch it, but pulled back at the last moment, a deep sense of unease washing over him. "This must be where they performed their rituals," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "The Fairbanks family. They were involved in something dark." Mark nodded, unable to tear his eyes away from the book. "We need to get out of here," he said finally, his voice shaking. "This place is dangerous." As they turned to leave, a low, guttural growl echoed through the basement, freezing them in their tracks. They spun around, but saw nothing in the darkness. The growl came again, closer this time, and they could feel the vibrations through the floor. "We need to move, now," Mark urged, grabbing Lisa's hand and pulling her towards the staircase. They scrambled up the stairs, their hearts pounding in their chests. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and they could hear the sound of claws scraping against the stone floor. They burst into the library, slamming the door behind them. "We have to find another way out," Mark said, his voice urgent. "That thing is still down there." Lisa nodded, her eyes wide with fear. They ran back through the library, searching for another exit. They found a hidden door behind one of the bookshelves, leading to a narrow passageway. The passage was cramped and dark, but it offered a glimmer of hope. They squeezed through the passage, the walls pressing in on them. The air was stale and thick with dust, and they could hear the distant sound of the growl echoing through the mansion. They emerged into a small, dimly lit room that appeared to be a servant's quarters. The furniture was old and decrepit, covered in a thick layer of dust. A small, grimy window offered a view of the overgrown garden outside. "We can break the window and escape through there," Mark said, already moving towards it. He picked up a chair and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered with a loud crash, the sound echoing through the mansion. They quickly cleared away the remaining shards and climbed through, emerging into the cold night air. The garden was wild and overgrown, the once manicured hedges now twisted and tangled. They ran through the underbrush, their breaths forming white plumes in the cold air. The mansion loomed behind them, its dark silhouette a reminder of the horrors within. As they reached the edge of the garden, they heard the growl again, louder and closer. They didn't look back, fear driving them forward. They broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the winding road, their hearts pounding in their chests. "We need to get to the car," Lisa gasped, her voice trembling. They ran down the road, the mansion receding into the distance. The night was eerily silent, the only sound their ragged breaths and the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. They reached the car and fumbled with the keys, their hands shaking. Finally, they managed to unlock the doors and scramble inside. Mark started the engine, the roar of the car breaking the silence. They sped down the road, leaving the mansion and its horrors behind. As they drove back towards town, the adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling fear. They didn't speak, the reality of what they had experienced settling over them like a dark cloud. The mansion had been more than just an abandoned house. It was a place of darkness and malevolence, a testament to the evil that had once dwelled within. And as they drove away, they couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped, that the darkness of the Fairbanks estate would follow them, haunting their dreams and their waking moments. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, they knew that their lives would never be the same. Chapter 3. The Disappearance. As Mark and Lisa drove back into town, they could see the lights of Pine Hollow glowing softly in the distance. The 4th of July celebration was in full swing, and the sounds of laughter, music, and fireworks echoed faintly through the air. It was a stark contrast to the nightmare they had just escaped, and for a moment, they allowed themselves to believe that they were safe. They parked the car near the town square and joined the throngs of people milling about. The festive atmosphere did little to soothe their frayed nerves, but they found comfort in the presence of others. They hoped that blending in with the crowd would keep them hidden from whatever malevolent force haunted the Fairbanks estate. The town square was decorated with strings of colorful lights and patriotic banners. Food stalls lined the streets, offering an array of treats, from cotton candy to hot dogs. Children ran about, waving sparklers and laughing, their joy a stark contrast to the terror that gripped Mark and Lisa's hearts. As they wandered through the crowd, they noticed familiar faces, neighbors, co-workers, and friends, all seemingly unaware of the dark events unfolding at the edge of town. Mark's boss, Mr. Granger, was chatting animatedly with the mayor, and Lisa's friend, Emma, was serving lemonade at a booth. "Maybe we should tell someone," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "The police, the mayor. Someone has to know about that place." Mark shook his head, his expression grim. "We need proof. If we go to the authorities with a story about haunted mansions and dark rituals, they'll think we're crazy." They continued to weave through the crowd, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. The fireworks display was scheduled to begin soon, and people were starting to gather in the open field at the center of town. As they moved closer to the field, Lisa felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down her spine. "Mark, look," she said, pointing towards a group of people standing at the edge of the field. "Do you see that?" Mark followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. The group of people she had pointed to stood eerily still, their faces blank and emotionless, just like the guests at the Fairbanks estate. They moved in perfect unison, their eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something. "Those are the same people from the mansion," Mark whispered, his voice filled with dread. "What are they doing here?" As they watched, the group began to move, walking towards the heart of the crowd. Their movements were deliberate, almost robotic, and they seemed to glide through the throngs of people without attracting any attention. Mark and Lisa exchanged a worried glance and followed them at a distance, trying to stay out of sight. The group stopped near the center of the field, where a large stage had been set up for the fireworks display. A man in a black suit, identical to the one they had seen at the mansion, stood on the stage, holding a microphone. His eyes glinted with an unnatural light, and a chilling smile played on his lips. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and resonant. "Welcome to the grand finale of our 4th of July celebration. We have a truly spectacular show for you tonight." The crowd erupted into applause, oblivious to the danger lurking among them. Mark and Lisa watched in horror as the man raised his hands, signaling the start of the fireworks. The first explosion lit up the sky, a brilliant burst of red and gold that drew cheers from the spectators. But as the fireworks continued, something strange began to happen. The colors grew more intense, almost blinding, and the air was filled with a strange, metallic smell. The crowd's cheers turned to gasps of awe, then to murmurs of confusion as the sky darkened unnaturally, swallowing the light of the fireworks. Mark felt a deep, throbbing pain in his head, as if something were trying to force its way into his mind. He glanced at Lisa and saw that she was experiencing the same thing, her face contorted in pain. The crowd around them began to change, their expressions turning blank and lifeless, mirroring the group from the mansion. "We have to get out of here," Mark gasped, clutching his head. "Now." They turned to flee, but found their path blocked by more emotionless faces. The townspeople had formed a tight circle around them, their eyes glazed and unseeing. The man in the black suit continued to speak, his voice echoing through the field, but the words were lost in the throbbing pain that filled Mark's head. He felt a cold hand grip his arm and turned to see Lisa being pulled away by one of the emotionless townspeople. He lunged towards her, but was grabbed from behind, the grip like iron. The crowd closed in around them, their faces devoid of life, their movements synchronized and mechanical. Panic surged through Mark as he struggled to break free. "Lisa," he shouted, his voice lost in the cacophony of whispers that filled the air. The pain in his head intensified, and he felt his vision begin to blur. He watched helplessly as Lisa was dragged away, her eyes wide with terror. In the midst of the chaos, Mark's gaze locked onto the man in the black suit. The man's eyes bore into his, filled with a malevolent intelligence. Mark felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized the truth. The man was controlling them, manipulating their minds and bodies like puppets. With a final surge of strength, Mark tore himself free from the crowd and stumbled towards the stage. He knew he had to stop the man, to break the spell that had ensnared the townspeople. He climbed onto the stage, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The man in the black suit turned to face him, his smile widening. "Ah, Mr. Mark," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "So nice of you to join us." Mark ignored the taunt and lunged at the man, but his movements were sluggish, his limbs heavy. The man raised a hand and Mark felt an invisible force slam into him, knocking him to the ground. He struggled to rise, but his body refused to obey. "You see," the man continued, stepping closer. "This town, these people, they belong to me now, just as you will." Mark's vision darkened, the pain in his head unbearable. He could see Lisa in the crowd, her face twisted in agony, her eyes pleading for help. He tried to reach out to her, but his body was paralyzed, held captive by the man's will. "Goodbye, Mr. Mark," the man said softly, his voice echoing in Mark's mind. "Enjoy the show." With that, the man turned away, raising his arms to the sky. The fireworks exploded in a final, blinding burst of light, and the crowd erupted into mindless applause. Mark felt his consciousness slip away, the darkness swallowing him whole. When he awoke, he was alone in a dark room. The air was cold and damp, and the only sound was the distant drip of water. He tried to move, but his body was bound, his wrists and ankles shackled to the floor. Panic surged through him as he realized he was back in the mansion, trapped in its malevolent embrace. He heard a faint, familiar whisper, and turned his head to see Lisa lying next to him, her eyes closed. She was bound as well, her face pale and drawn. Mark struggled against his restraints, desperate to reach her. "Lisa," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Lisa, wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a mixture of relief and fear. "Mark, where are we?" "We're in the mansion," he replied, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here. We need to find a way to stop him." As they lay there in the darkness, the faint sound of chanting began to fill the air, growing louder and more insistent. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the truth. The ritual wasn't over. The man in the black suit was still out there, still controlling the townspeople, still feeding off their fear. And as the chanting grew louder, the walls of the mansion seemed to close in around them, the darkness pressing down like a suffocating shroud. Mark knew that their nightmare was far from over, and that they would have to face the horrors of the Fairbanks estate if they were to survive. The 4th of July had become a night of terror, a twisted celebration of darkness and despair. And as the final echoes of the fireworks faded into the night, Mark and Lisa braced themselves for the battle to come, knowing that the true horror was only just beginning. Chapter 4. The Revelation. The cold, damp air of the basement clawed at Mark's skin as he struggled against his restraints. Lisa lay beside him, her eyes wide with fear and determination. The chanting from above grew louder, a rhythmic incantation that reverberated through the very bones of the mansion. Shadows danced on the stone walls, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to leer and mock their helplessness. "We have to get out of here," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible over the chanting. "There has to be a way." Mark nodded, his eyes scanning the dark room for any means of escape. The basement was filled with old, rusted equipment and broken furniture, remnants of the mansion's long-forgotten past. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, a testament to the years of neglect. As Mark tugged at his shackles, he noticed something glinting in the dim light. A rusted nail protruded from the wall just within reach. Desperation fueled his efforts as he stretched his fingers towards it, the metal digging into his skin. Finally, he grasped the nail and began to work it against the lock of his restraints. Minutes felt like hours as Mark painstakingly maneuvered the nail, the lock finally giving way with a soft click. He quickly freed his other hand and then moved to release Lisa. They both stood, their limbs aching from the prolonged confinement. "We need to find a weapon," Mark said, his voice hushed but urgent. "Something to defend ourselves." They scoured the basement, their eyes adjusting to the gloom. Lisa found an old, rusted crowbar, and Mark grabbed a length of pipe. Armed with their makeshift weapons, they crept towards the staircase, the chanting growing louder with each step. As they ascended, the air grew colder, the oppressive weight of the mansion's dark history pressing down on them. The staircase led to a narrow corridor, its walls lined with more faded portraits. The eyes of the long-dead Fairbanks family members seemed to follow their every move, their expressions twisted into grotesque masks of disapproval. At the end of the corridor, they found a heavy wooden door slightly ajar. The chanting was deafening now, a malevolent chorus that seemed to seep into their very souls. Mark pushed the door open, revealing a large, dimly lit room filled with townspeople standing in perfect, eerie unison. At the center of the room stood the man in the black suit, his arms raised in a triumphant pose. "Welcome," he intoned, his voice carrying a dark, sinister power. "You have arrived just in time for the grand finale." Mark and Lisa moved cautiously through the crowd, their eyes fixed on the man. The townspeople, their faces blank and emotionless, parted to allow them passage. It was as if they were being drawn towards the center of the room, towards the man who held them all in thrall. "Who are you?" Mark demanded, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "What do you want from us?" The man lowered his arms, a cold smile spreading across his face. "I am Nathaniel Fairbanks, the last of the Fairbanks line. This town, this night, it is all part of my family's legacy. A legacy of power and control." Lisa tightened her grip on the crowbar. "You're controlling these people. You're using them for your rituals." Nathaniel's smile widened. "Indeed. The Fairbanks family has always dabbled in the arcane, seeking power through ancient rituals and dark magic. Tonight, on this most auspicious of nights, the final ritual will be completed, and my power will be absolute." Mark felt a surge of anger. "Not if we stop you." Nathaniel laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the room. "You are welcome to try. But you will find that the power of the Fairbanks family is not so easily overcome." With a wave of his hand, Nathaniel summoned a group of townspeople to block Mark and Lisa's path. Their eyes were empty, their movements mechanical. Mark swung the pipe, trying to fend them off, but their strength was unnaturally enhanced. They moved with a precision and force that was inhuman. Lisa fought beside him, her crowbar connecting with sickening thuds. But for every townspeople they knocked down, more took their place, advancing relentlessly. The chanting grew louder, filling the room with a pulsating, almost tangible darkness. "We can't keep this up," Lisa panted, her eyes darting around the room. "There has to be another way." Mark's mind raced. They needed to break Nathaniel's control, to sever the connection he had with the townspeople. But how? The answer came to him in a sudden, desperate flash. The book, the one they had seen in the library. It had to hold the key. "Lisa, the book," he shouted. "We need to find the book. It's in the library." She nodded, understanding immediately. They fought their way through the crowd, aiming for the door that led to the library. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed as he realized their intent. "Stop them," he commanded, his voice resonating with dark power. The townspeople surged forward, their faces twisted into masks of rage. Mark and Lisa pushed through, their determination fueled by the hope of stopping Nathaniel's madness. They burst into the library, slamming the door behind them. "Find the book," Mark said urgently, scanning the room. "It has to be here." They tore through the shelves, searching frantically. The room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the walls closing in around them. Finally, Lisa let out a triumphant cry, pulling the ancient, leather-bound tome from a dusty shelf. "Got it," she said, flipping through the pages. "We need to find the spell he's using." Mark scanned the book over her shoulder. The symbols and diagrams seemed to writhe and shift on the page, as if alive. They found a section that matched the ritual they had witnessed, filled with dark incantations and intricate symbols. "This is it," Mark said, his voice filled with determination. "We need to reverse the spell." Lisa nodded, her eyes fierce. "Let's do it." They began to chant, their voices shaking but growing stronger with each word. The air around them crackled with energy, the pages of the book glowing with an eerie light. As they spoke the final words, a deafening roar filled the room, and a wave of dark energy exploded outward. The library shook, the walls cracking and crumbling. Mark and Lisa clung to each other as the darkness seemed to implode, collapsing in on itself. The chanting from the main room ceased abruptly, replaced by confused murmurs and cries. When the dust settled, they emerged from the library to find the townspeople dazed and disoriented, their eyes no longer vacant. Nathaniel lay on the floor, his body convulsing, his face twisted in rage and pain. You cannot stop me," he hissed, his voice weak and trembling. "The power of the Fairbanks family will never die." Mark stepped forward, his eyes blazing with defiance. "It's over, Nathaniel. Your reign of terror ends tonight." Nathaniel let out a final, guttural scream as the last of his power drained away, leaving him a withered husk. The room fell silent, the oppressive darkness lifting. The townspeople began to come to their senses, looking around in confusion and fear. Lisa took Mark's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "We did it," she said softly. "It's over." But as they looked around at the faces of the townspeople, they knew that the scars of this night would linger. The Fairbanks legacy had cast a long, dark shadow over Pine Hollow, and it would take time for the town to heal. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon, Mark and Lisa knew that they had faced true darkness and survived. But they also knew that the memory of the Fairbanks estate would haunt them forever, a reminder of the evil that had once gripped their town and the strength it had taken to break free. And as the sun rose, bathing the town in its golden light, they walked forward together, ready to face whatever the future might hold, their bond stronger for the horrors they had endured. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Past. The early morning sun cast long shadows over Pine Hollow as the townspeople slowly regained their senses. The once festive atmosphere was now tinged with confusion and fear. Mark and Lisa, their faces grim and exhausted, made their way through the crowd, offering what comfort they could. The events of the previous night lingered heavily in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of the terror that had gripped the town. As the day wore on, whispers spread among the townspeople. Stories of strange dreams and glimpses of shadows out of the corner of their eyes became common. The Fairbanks estate had left a mark on Pine Hollow, one that would not fade easily. Mark and Lisa returned to their home, a small, cozy house on the outskirts of town. They were physically and emotionally drained, their minds replaying the horrors they had faced. As they sat together in the living room, Lisa turned to Mark, her eyes filled with a lingering fear. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I want to believe it is, but something tells me we're not out of the woods yet. The Fairbanks family had a lot of power. I doubt it's completely gone." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mark stood, his muscles tense, and opened it to find Sheriff Dawson standing on the porch. The sheriff's face was lined with worry, his usually stern demeanor softened by the events of the previous night. "Morning, Sheriff," Mark greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you here?" Dawson removed his hat, holding it in his hands as he spoke. "Morning, Mark. Lisa, I came by to talk about what happened last night. The whole town's in an uproar, and folks are scared. We need to figure out what to do next." Lisa nodded, her expression serious. "We saw Sheriff. Things that can't be explained. Nathaniel Fairbanks was using some kind of dark magic. We managed to stop him, but we're not sure if it's really over." The sheriff's eyes widened slightly. "Dark magic? Damn. I was hoping it was something more normal. But with everything we've seen, I can't say I'm surprised." Mark leaned forward, his voice urgent. "We need to investigate the mansion. There might be more clues, something we missed. We can't let this happen again." Dawson nodded in agreement. "I'll gather a few deputies and meet you there in an hour. We need to be thorough. If there's anything left of Nathaniel's power, we have to destroy it." An hour later, Mark, Lisa, and the sheriff, along with 2 deputies, stood at the gates of the Fairbanks estate. The mansion loomed before them, its dark silhouette stark against the bright morning sky. Despite the sunlight, the estate exuded an aura of malevolence, as if the very land itself was tainted by the evil that had once resided there. They entered the mansion cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The once opulent interior was now a scene of decay and neglect. Cobwebs draped the corners, and dust covered every surface. The air was thick with the scent of mold and rot. "We need to find that basement," Mark said, leading the group towards the library. "That's where we found the ritual book. There might be more down there." As they descended the staircase to the basement, the temperature dropped noticeably. The darkness seemed to press in on them, and the faint sound of whispering voices could be heard, barely audible but unmistakable. They reached the basement, and Lisa shivered as she looked around. "It's colder than it was last night," she remarked, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Almost like the place itself is alive." The group spread out, searching the basement for any hidden compartments or secret passages. Mark and Lisa returned to the table where they had found the ritual book, hoping to find more clues. "Look at this," Lisa said, pointing to a hidden drawer in the table. Mark pried it open, revealing a set of ancient, yellowed papers covered in cryptic symbols and handwritten notes. "These look like instructions for the rituals," Mark said, scanning the papers. "If we can decipher them, we might find a way to undo whatever lingering effects Nathaniel left behind." Sheriff Dawson joined them, his face grim. "We found something too. There's a hidden room behind one of the walls, filled with strange artifacts and more books. This place is a treasure trove of dark magic." They followed the sheriff to the hidden room, the air growing colder with each step. The room was small and cluttered, filled with shelves of books, jars of strange substances, and bizarre artifacts. A large, ancient-looking mirror dominated one wall, its surface dark and foreboding. As they searched the room, Mark felt an odd compulsion to approach the mirror. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold glass. The surface rippled like water, and a faint, ghostly image appeared: Nathaniel Fairbanks, his eyes burning with malevolence. "You cannot destroy me," the image hissed, its voice echoing through the room. "The power of the Fairbanks family is eternal. I will return, and you will suffer." Mark stumbled back, his heart racing. "We need to destroy this mirror," he said, his voice shaking. "It's some kind of conduit for Nathaniel's spirit." Lisa nodded, grabbing the crowbar they had brought with them. She swung it at the mirror with all her strength, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. The shards fell to the floor, the room suddenly feeling lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. But as the dust settled, they heard a low, guttural growl from behind them. They turned to see a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It was a twisted, monstrous form, a grotesque manifestation of Nathaniel's lingering power. "Destroy it," Sheriff Dawson shouted, drawing his gun and firing at the creature. The bullets passed through it harmlessly, the shadow advancing with a menacing growl. Mark and Lisa grabbed their makeshift weapons and attacked the creature, their blows landing with a strange, ethereal resistance. The creature shrieked in rage, its form flickering and wavering. "We need to find the source of its power," Mark yelled, dodging a swipe from the creature's claws. There must be something anchoring it here. Lisa spotted an old, ornate chest in the corner of the room. "There," she shouted, pointing. "That chest, it's radiating energy." Mark and the sheriff moved towards the chest, while Lisa and the deputies kept the creature at bay. The chest was locked, but Mark used the crowbar to pry it open, revealing a collection of ancient relics and a large, black crystal pulsing with a dark light. "That's it," Mark said. "We need to destroy the crystal." He grabbed the crystal and smashed it against the floor, the dark light exploding outward in a blinding flash. The creature let out a final, agonized scream before dissipating into nothingness, the room falling silent once more. Breathing heavily, Mark and Lisa stood amidst the wreckage, their hearts pounding. "Is it over?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sheriff Dawson nodded, his expression relieved. "I think so. Whatever power Nathaniel had, it's gone now. You did it." As they made their way out of the mansion, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the estate. The townspeople, still dazed but slowly recovering, gathered outside, their expressions a mix of fear and hope. Mark and Lisa stood together, their hands clasped tightly. They had faced true darkness and emerged victorious, but they knew that the memory of the Fairbanks estate would haunt them forever. The town had suffered, but with time, they hoped to heal and move forward. As the first stars appeared in the sky, a sense of calm settled over Pine Hollow. The nightmare was over, but the echoes of the past would linger, a reminder of the darkness that had once threatened their town. And as they looked towards the future, Mark and Lisa knew that they would face it together, their bond unbreakable, their strength forged in the crucible of terror. Chapter 6. The Last Stand. The relief that settled over Pine Hollow after the destruction of Nathaniel Fairbanks' dark power was short-lived. The town tried to return to normalcy, but an eerie stillness hung in the air. People whispered about the events, eyes darting to the shadows as if expecting something to emerge. Mark and Lisa, though exhausted and hoping for peace, sensed an unfinished malevolence lurking beneath the surface. Days turned into weeks, and the sense of unease only grew. Strange occurrences began to plague the town. Animals were found mutilated in the woods, and a chilling wind blew through the streets at night, carrying with it whispers in an unknown language. Mark and Lisa knew they couldn't ignore these signs. The Fairbanks legacy was not so easily eradicated. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows over their home, Mark received a phone call. It was Sheriff Dawson, his voice trembling with urgency. "Mark, you and Lisa need to get to the station. Now, we found something in the mansion that you need to see." Mark's heart sank. He glanced at Lisa, who had been anxiously watching him. She nodded, understanding without words. They arrived at the sheriff's station to find Dawson and his deputies gathered around a large wooden crate. It was old, the wood splintered and dark with age. The sheriff's face was grim as he lifted the lid. Inside was an ornate box, covered in strange symbols and bound with iron. It pulsed with a faint, eerie light, as if something inside was alive. "We found this hidden in the basement, beneath the floorboards," Dawson explained. "It's some kind of containment box, but we can't open it. We think it might be the source of the disturbances." Mark stared at the box, a sense of dread washing over him. "It must be another of Nathaniel's traps. We need to be careful. Whatever's inside could be even more dangerous than the crystal." Lisa stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the box. "We need to destroy it, but we can't just smash it open. There might be spells or protections we need to break first." Dawson nodded. "We've called in an expert, Professor Eliza Mortimer from the university. She's studied ancient rituals and dark magic. She should be here soon." As if on cue, the door swung open, and a tall, thin woman with sharp features and piercing blue eyes entered. She moved with a purpose, her long coat billowing behind her. "I'm Professor Mortimer," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "Let me see this box." She examined it closely, tracing the symbols with her fingers and muttering under her breath. After a tense few moments, she looked up. "This is a containment box, designed to trap a powerful entity. Nathaniel Fairbanks must have used it to imprison something or someone. We need to perform a cleansing ritual to safely open it and destroy whatever's inside." Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. What kind of entity are we talking about? Mortimer's eyes were grave. Something ancient and malevolent. A spirit or demon that Nathaniel summoned for his rituals. We need to be prepared for anything. They gathered the necessary materials: candles, salt, and sacred herbs. Mortimer instructed them to form a circle around the box, placing the items at specific points to create a protective barrier. As the ritual began, the air grew thick with tension. Mortimer's voice rose and fell in a rhythmic chant, the candles flickering in response. The box began to vibrate, a low hum emanating from within. Mark and Lisa exchanged nervous glances, their hands gripping each other tightly. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding light. The box shook violently, and a deafening roar echoed through the station. The light intensified, and with a final, shattering explosion, the box flew open. A dark, swirling mist erupted from within, coalescing into a towering figure. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural fire, and its form seemed to shift and waver, as if it were made of shadows. "You fools," the entity hissed, its voice a guttural growl. "You think you can destroy me? I am eternal." Mortimer's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold the barrier. Do not let it escape." The entity lunged at the circle, but the protective barrier held. It howled in fury, its form writhing against the invisible walls. "We need to weaken it," Mortimer shouted. "Recite the incantation with me." Mark, Lisa, and Dawson joined in, their voices rising in unison. The entity thrashed and screamed, its power waning with each word. The candles flared, and the circle glowed with a brilliant light. The entity let out a final, agonized wail before it began to disintegrate, its form dissolving into the air. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the last of the dark mist vanished. Breathing heavily, they looked around, the reality of what they had faced sinking in. The box lay empty, its power extinguished. Mortimer wiped sweat from her brow, her face pale but triumphant. "It's done," she said, her voice shaking. "We've banished the entity. The town should be safe now." But Mark couldn't shake a lingering feeling of dread. He stepped forward, examining the box more closely. What if there are more like this? More traps or entities left behind? Mortimer nodded. "It's possible." Nathaniel's influence ran deep. "We need to search the mansion thoroughly. Make sure there are no more hidden threats." The following days were a blur of activity. Mortimer, with the help of Mark, Lisa, and the sheriff, led a meticulous search of the Fairbanks estate. They uncovered more artifacts, each one more sinister than the last. Dark tomes filled with forbidden knowledge, cursed relics, and remnants of long-forgotten rituals. Each discovery reinforced the reality of the horrors that had plagued Pine Hollow. The townspeople, though still fearful, began to come together, their shared experience forging a bond of resilience and determination. One evening, as Mark and Lisa sat on their porch, watching the stars, Lisa turned to Mark, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the lanterns. "Do you think we'll ever truly be free of this?" she asked softly. "The darkness, the fear it feels like it's become a part of us." Mark wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I don't know. But what I do know is that we faced it together, and we survived. As long as we have each other, we can face whatever comes." Lisa smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You're right. We're stronger together. As they sat in the quiet night, the town of Pine Hollow slowly began to heal. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. And as long as they stood together, they knew they could overcome anything. But deep in the shadows of the Fairbanks estate, beneath the crumbling foundations and the layers of history, something stirred. The echoes of the past were not so easily silenced, and the darkness, though banished, had left its mark. And in the quiet of the night, the whispering began again, a faint, sinister promise that the Fairbanks legacy was far from over.